What is going on, y'all? I'm KMBest, and these are my favorite decks in Marvel Snap this week. Now, this week saw a couple of OTA changes and a real shakeup in the metagame, but fundamentally, the same type of decks are still at the top of this metagame. As you can see, the only stats deck, Black Bolt Stature, Zabu, that kind of deck is still dominant, in my opinion. Now, this list is very close to a list that KJB used to finish first place in the Snap.Fan Open. It is a version of the deck that leverages Iron Lad. Now, Iron Lad pushes you away from running too many tech cards, but he's still including the Enchantress to target the mirror. You can see that there are some flex spots in here. So, for example, if you wanted to drop Enchantress for Miles and just give up on running tech at all, you could try that. If you wanted to replace Jeff with Armor to target Deathwave, Scorpion to target the Mirror, you could try that as well. These are all viable options, in my opinion. Another card that could replace Jeff, I think, would be Scarlet Witch. I am generally pretty big on including her when I can, and she's just a really, really good card to have in your back pocket, but of course she comes with the downside of you not knowing what the result is going to be. But there are definitely cards you can swap in for Jeff if you don't have Jeff. I do think Nebula is likely right now to be the best option in the one drop slot, but you also have options like Iceman, things like that. And we're going to be covering every deck in here in terms of what you can and cannot replace. So let's move on to the sort of elephant in the room here. Iron Lad himself, I do think he makes this deck just a little bit better by making the deck just a little bit more straightforward, less reactive, more proactive. So Iron Lad here, if you don't have Iron Lad, you don't play this exact list, but you can include still other cards in the list and play a similar Black Bolt Stature deck. And you notice this one is the only stats deck with Lad in it. Well, the next deck is the only stats deck without Lad. And as you can see, a little bit of changes, not too many. This is the classic only stats deck, and this version was piloted by Torakun to a second place finish in the Snap.Fan Open. It's also just the list, right? Like, this is the 12 card deck that most people are playing at this point. And the fact that the Iron Lad list, I do think it's a little bit favored in the mirror, and I think that matters a ton. But this list is still 100% fine. The Iron Lad list, if it is an upgrade, it's a fairly minimal one, in my opinion. Over this, you are totally fine to be playing this on ladder. Obviously, you're playing Black Bolt and Stature to get a bunch of points on the board. Your Zabu into Rock Slide for a disruption to buff your Darkhawk. Everyone kind of knows what your deal here is. Black Bolt Stature cheats stats. Zabu cheats stats. And Miles gets stats with Jeff and Polaris. So free Miles, right? Now, one of the downsides of this compared to the Lad deck is it's a little bit more finicky to get value out of your Miles than it is to get value out of your Iron Lad. You know, in order to get value out of your Miles, you just have to like move your stuff, and then that changes like what your curve is. You Polaris on 3, you go like Miles plus something else on 4, maybe another 4-drop if you already played Zabu, but then if you didn't, it gets harder and harder to fit him in. And Iron Lad, you just kind of need to play the card Iron Lad. So there is kind of a material difference in terms of how easy the lists are to play. I do think the first list we showed is a little bit easier, and in my opinion, just a little bit stronger. Next up is the over-the-top Patriot Iron Lad list. I have added a Cosmo in here for Misty Knight at the suggestion of Braude and several others. And this list, with the Misty Knight in it, finished first place in an EGL tournament in the hands of my podcast partner, Brendan APG. And this list with the Cosmo in it finished in the top 8 of the Snap.Fan Open. Without the Cosmo, I've been playing without the Cosmo on ladder, but I think the Cosmo makes a ton of sense in a tournament metagame that is still rife with Enchantress and less people sort of messing around. So if you are seeing Enchantress Cosmos really good, it does make the deck a little bit harder to play. It especially makes your Iron Lads a little bit harder to play, but it is a very powerful card for turning off the number one card people are going to be playing against you. So in the Snap.Fan Open, there were like more than 40 Enchantresses, and there were only like 6 Super Scrolls. So if you want to beat Enchantress, the Cosmo is a really good thing to do here. In terms of what you can do if you don't have Iron Lad, I think you just play a different Patriot deck. And maybe you put Super Scroll in your Patriot deck in case you ever run into this. Other than that, most of the cards in this deck are very obtainable for the average player, and you should be able to put it together and get the job done regardless. Now, the way I've always thought of the only stats lists is that they're sort of Sarah plus, right? What does Sarah have that they don't have? And this list makes it very clear what Sarah has that the other decks don't. And the answer is Killmonger. Sarah has Killmonger and Nova. That's the reason you'd want to play this over any of the Black Bolt stature lists. If you're thinking, I need Killmonger for whatever reason that may be, that's why you move to Sarah. Now you see you're leveraging a lot of the same things as the Black Bolt stature lists. You're leveraging Darkhawk and Shang-Chi and Enchantress and Rock Slide. And you have Sarah as your alt Black Bolt that discounts more things than just stature. Like that's what you're doing here. And the main difference is that you get Killmonger Nova. And that's a really powerful thing to have. So if you're in the kind of meta where you really want to be playing Killmonger Nova, but you don't want to be playing Deathwave because maybe you want to be Killmongering on the final turn of the game, this is the kind of thing you will want to be looking into. I do think on the whole, the power level a little bit lower than the only stats lists, but it does benefit a lot from experienced pilots. Now, if you don't have Darkhawk and Zabu, but you did buy the Battle Pass last season, you can try a much more slimmed down version of the deck. To be honest with you, this is my preferred version of Sarah. I feel like the other one is too close to just being a bad only stats, whereas this deck is actually leveraging some other things. So a little bit more confusion as to like where those numbers go, a larger range of outcomes on the back end. That's just sort of where I'm at with it in terms of this. It's lower power, but I feel like it's more confusing to play against this and more annoying to play against this. And you have Green Goblin and Polaris, so you're good into Galactus. You have a lot of matchups covered, but you have a little bit lower power level. And that's just the kind of deck that sometimes that's what appeals to me. And when I'm in that mood, this is the list that I play. The Green Goblin is absolutely a flex spot. You can pretty much do whatever you want with that spot. For a while, I had Leader in there when Sandman was a dominant thing. I wouldn't do that right now, but that's really more to illustrate. You can kind of put whatever you want in that spot. I think most of the rest of what I've done here is roughly correct, but if you want to put like Bishop in there, go nuts. So this list is Lambda Series' Thanos list, and I have marked it for true Thanos believers only. It's good if you are willing to understand the snap profile of this list. If you are not someone who is willing to snap aggressively on good early draws and risk getting blown out, this is not the list for you. You have to maximize your good hands with this list more than with any other list. Now, I will say that makes it a really good list for learning how to improve and learning when to pull the trigger in uncertain situations, because you also have to be willing to leave when you are doing something mopey, because you're going to do a lot of mopey stuff with this deck, and you need to be staying in the games and maximizing your winnings from the games where you go off and minimizing your losses from the games where you don't. So, true Thanos believers, feel free. Go nuts. I do think there are better things for the average player to do. This might be my bias. I'll be honest with you, chat. I think this one is where we start getting into my bias, but I have been a MODOK truther for a little bit now. I think this deck is really good. It is able to match a lot of the only stats decks on points, and it is able to do so in a way that leverages things like Storm that are good in other matchups. I generally just think it's an underrated deck in terms of putting points on the board, but one issue that it does have is when it doesn't do its thing, it's very, very poor. But when it does do something like Dracula into MODOK, discarding Apocalypse and a couple swarms, it's unbelievable. Morbius, Storm, Dracula, MODOK, one of the most powerful plays you can make in this game going from turn 2 to turn 5. Ridiculously strong. Very, very, very powerful play to make. And you get to sort of play a quasi lane lock game with this, where you can leverage Storm, you can leverage Nebula a little bit. But the recent rise in Doctor Dooms makes those Storm lanes a bit more suspect, means you might have to invest more in them, does change the risk profile of this list. So you do have to be aware of that if you're going to be including Storm. I would consider her a flex spot, but she's just so good in the deck. And so for now, I think this is the list that I would be playing with her. In this archetype, though, if you don't have Nebula, feel free to replace her with Iceman. I'm not even sure she's worse straight up. So finally, we come to, I guess I would say, like an underrated pillar of the metagame, wave decks. Now, I am generally lower on wave decks than most because I tend to think that the Black Bolt list is very, 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 very good into them. Like, it's just tough being in a situation where your job is to make your wave asymmetrical, and then they have like stature, their Black Bolt discards your death, and it's just like, oh my god, this isn't even doing anything. It's like asymmetrical for them instead of me. So my solution to that was just jam all the Zabu stuff in my deck, and then we're like kind of a side grade to the Zabu Black Bolt stuff, where in exchange for being like basically what we get is the ability to play wave in our Zabu deck, and that sort of lets us like decks like Moon Girl, decks like Bounce. We actually tend to struggle against those as the Black Bolt deck because they're like pure combo points on the board. They can kind of go bigger. They probably can't go bigger if you play Wave on turn 5. That's when you want to play this, is if you're running into a lot of Moon Girl, a lot of Bounce, a lot of Sarah, suddenly this is a lot more plausible. Now, if you're running into a lot of Black Bolt, you don't really want to be relying on Wave. This is a better version of relying on Wave. I found that I felt pretty even in the pseudo mirror when I was playing this and my opponents were playing Black Bolt and stature, but it's definitely tough to manage, in my opinion. Finally, Death Wave, which I think is a fairly mediocre list. I think you can probably do better. But it's on here because you should know what it does, and you should know how to play it, and you should know how to play against it. Death Wave is at its best when it blows up Bucky and then plays Wave on turn 5. I know that sounds obvious, but that is the facts. Death Wave can run hot and beat almost any deck as long as it is getting Bucky dead and it is playing Wave on 5. It is still very good. The issue is there are more cards that make your wave bad now. Miles, Stature, Sarah, Zabu. All of these are in basically every other deck that we talked about today. And all of them prevent you from making this hyper asymmetrical wave play. Now, you can do what you want. I don't think I would necessarily play this. I do think it's like, in the range of the Black Bolt stature deck. It's good enough to compete when things go right. But I think on balance, you might be better off looking somewhere else. That said, if you are running into a bunch of stuff that is cold to wave, there is no better way than to play a wave deck, right? Like if you're running into Bounce, if you're running into these decks and you want them to get out of your game, phenomenal way to make that happen. So if you think I missed anything, please let me know in the comments. I read every single one of them, much to my own detriment. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I am KMBest. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed the video, which if you're here, hopefully you did, make sure you drop a like or a subscribe, or maybe both, who knows, on this channel. Thank you so much. Have a good one.